Howdy there, friends, family, adversaries, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary folks. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Riley Constantine, and today we are reviewing Resident Evil Village, which is the recently released 8th mainline entry in Capcom's long-running survival horror series that is available on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PC, Xbox Series S and X, and PlayStation 5. This should be a good, spoiler-free episode, so without further ado, here we go. Resident Evil Village embodies the Resident Evil franchise's grisly moniker. This new mainline entry in Capcom's long-running survival horror series features all the scares, action, and fun camp that fans have come to expect from this decades-old franchise, all while being narratively and thematically designed to reflect the series' roots. In many areas, the game is terrifying, suspenseful, and has plenty of action sequences that perfectly complement the macabre narrative it is telling, all while also embodying and representing the Resident Evil franchise's core themes, and in this regard, Resident Evil Village is quintessential Resident Evil. It is a great game that contains all the various gameplay, thematic, and storytelling nuances of the franchise, and as a result, it ranks among the best Resident Evil titles. Yes, really, Resident Evil Village is so good that it deserves to be placed alongside Resident Evil 4 and 2. The game features many similar franchisal elements such as suspenseful action sequences, a great pace, memorable villains, and a location that has its own character and feel, all while featuring many newer elements like a first-person perspective and the modern horror intricacies that made Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, i.e. the previous mainline Resident Evil title, a big hit. And in many regards, Resident Evil Village ranks among the top tier of Resident Evil games. It features boatloads of many components that complement and enhance each other. The pacing, the action, the horror, and the sly sense of humor all combine to create a terrific fairy tale of horrors and a truly compelling narrative experience. And yes, the narrative alone is very compelling. The plot follows Ethan Winters, who was the main protagonist of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. In that previous game, Ethan traveled to Louisiana in order to find his missing girlfriend Mia, only for him to learn that she had been abducted by the Baker family, who are a group of rogues that have gone off the deep end. In normal times, the Baker family would be a nice group of people who owned a convoluted labyrinthine estate, but at the time of the game's start, the family had been infected and corrupted by a new form of virus that turned them into superhuman monsters, and it was up to Ethan to rescue Mia and escape the violent, unhinged hands of the Baker family. Ultimately, Ethan and Mia prevailed, but they were left with severe mental and emotional scars. This brings us back to Resident Evil Village. After surviving the horrifying events at the Baker Ranch, Ethan was hoping to acclimate to his new small-town European home with his wife Mia and newborn daughter Rose in order to leave his old trauma behind him. But unfortunately, Ethan's attempt at living a new family life doesn't go smoothly. For mysterious reason, Resident Evil mainstay Chris Redfield guns down and kills Mia and abducts Ethan and Rose, which is bad for obvious reasons. No one likes to get Richard Kimbled after all. However, this nightmarish event also runs into a complication. The armored vehicle transporting Rose and an unconscious Ethan is attacked, and Ethan awakes in an unknown location to a bunch of dead bodies and Rose missing. And from there, he makes his way to a rundown village that has come under siege via a virus outbreak that transforms its denizens into various monsters. Some are mindless lichen-type beasts, whereas others are more gifted, and Ethan must fight his way through all of them in order to rescue Rose from these new villainous captors. The story is really good. It features some brutal horror elements, it is exceptionally dark and bleak in some places, though there is definitely some fun camp to be had, and the main character Ethan Winters is a good POV protagonist that often says exactly what the player is thinking, mostly because he constantly remarks on how fucked up the whole situation in the game is, which allows us to see ourselves in the character and put us in his shoes. We can truly relate. With that said though, Resident Evil Village's best storytelling attribute comes in the form of its villains. The main antagonist is Mother Miranda, who the village worships as if she were a god, and she has several underlings that work as very unique bosses, such as the Nicolas Cage-inspired mechanical whiz Heisenberg, the Grima Wormtongue and Starscream hybrid Moreau, the creepy doll Biena Vieto, and Lady Dimitrescu, the super tall sexy vampire lady that I want to dominate me. And all of these villains have their own character flair that allow them them to stand out from each other, just like how many past Resident Evil villains have done for decades, because once again, Resident Evil Village truly is quintessential Resident Evil, and it is great for that. Resident Evil Village's gameplay progression is strong. The title features all the franchisal gameplay intricacies and the new elements introduced in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, all while also feeling like a fresh action horror title with a terrific sense of progress, fun action set pieces, combat, and boss fights. Even though Resident Evil Village is still a scary game with frightening monsters, unkillable villains that relentlessly hunt you, and incredible lighting that makes the player feel as if there is something just outside their field of vision waiting to pounce, just like how I do with a turkey on Thanksgiving, the game is definitely far more action-y than its predecessor. Despite this title's horrifying tendencies, especially House Vienna Vieto, which, oh my god, is one of the most disturbing slices of gameplay I've experienced in a long time, Resident Evil Village is an action horror game to its core. While for sure there are moments of palpable terror and times where the game expertly builds a sense of tension, Resident Evil Village is far more action-focused than Resident Evil 7. There are more weapons, upgrades, and ammunition than before, and there are a lot more enemy types than the basic mold monsters present in Resident Evil 7, which to be honest were kind of boring and hampered the overall combat aesthetic of that game. Yet Resident Evil Village's enemy types are far more varied. There are lycans, werewolves, vampires, and zombie-like machine thingies to fight, and as a result of these high-quality enemy types and the intensity of the enemy encounters, the game's combat feels varied and impressive. Where the boss fights were the high mark of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, Resident Evil Village's gameplay is just terrific all around. From the lowly lycans all the way to bosses like the stompy Lady Dimitrescu, everything is on point here. All the enemies are really fun to fight and have their own strengths and weaknesses. And due to this, strategy is paramount here, and the way you handle enemy encounters changes as the game moves on. In fact, each stage of the game has its own unique enemies, new weapons, puzzles, bosses, and gameplay styles that alter the way you play the game, which always keeps you on your toes and ensures that Resident Evil Village is far from predictable. Furthermore, Resident Evil Village's action is paced out incredibly well. Sure, the opening few hours of Resident Evil Village do instill a sense of pan-shitting terror into the player. After all, the early game tries to overwhelm you with a large quantity of enemies that are much tougher than you. But as you go throughout the game, Ethan becomes stronger. As you gather new weapons and upgrades, you slowly but surely turn the tables on these once tough enemies and decimate them. Where these enemies were once horrifyingly tough in the early game, they can now be beaten with enough firepower and strategic thinking. And while Resident Evil Village does introduce new tougher enemies throughout the game, you feel a sense of empowerment as your playthrough extends longer. Your character becomes noticeably stronger and more resilient, and by the endgame, there's a sense of catharsis as you kick the ever-loving shit out of enemies that terrorized you earlier in the game. Because the lycans can fuck off. This gameplay progression has a lot in common with Resident Evil 4, the game that me and many others rightfully view as the best Resident Evil title. Like Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 4 was more action-focused. While it certainly had its fair share of thrills and chills, Resident Evil 4 emphasized its new and improved combat system, most notably in the form of its third-person over-the-shoulder camera system that was a far more robust means of controlling the game compared to the archaic fixed-viewed camera system present in Resident Evils 1, 2, and 3. Though with that said, Resident Evil 4's once innovative control scheme is now seen as dated today. How ironic. Resident Evil 4 had a variety of enemies, weapons, campy but fun bosses, a merchant character that allows you to restock your ammo, and a gameplay progression system that lets you feel noticeably stronger as the game goes on. And all of these descriptors can easily be applied to Resident Evil Village as well, though Village is a much more modernized version. Whether it is the plethora of enemy types, Ethan's arsenal of weapons, entertaining villains, the quotable merchant character, or the aforementioned gameplay progression, Resident Evil Village features all these disparate elements that made Resident Evil 4 great, all while feeling like a brand new action horror experience. And as a result, Resident Evil Village can rightfully be regarded as one of Resident Evil's finest main entries. Never mind if you prefer Resident Evil games to be scarier, more actiony, or a mixture of the two, Resident Evil Village is wonderful. Speaking of horror though, it is worth noting that as action-oriented as this game is, there is still a certain level of intensity that permeates the entire experience. Sure, you won't be scrounging around for ammo as much this time around, and all the healthy plants that Ethan carries around in his magic briefcase of wonder ensure that you won't die all that many times, but there is a certain sense of suspense that is present throughout Resident Evil Village's entire runtime. Whether you are fighting lichens in a cornfield or need to evade a fish monster, the game mixes horrifying suspense with AAA action set pieces with ease, to the point that it didn't feel as if any of the scares had been sacrificed. The title just overall has a creepy and haunting atmosphere, and some moments that are genuinely disturbing, especially in House Bienvenido. Oh my god, fuck that place. Admittedly, Resident Evil Village isn't without faults. The usage of maps in the pause menu to point out checked and unchecked rooms remains very rudimentary, some of the combat controls are a bit floaty, and the last section in Heisenberg's factory is a smidge too long. But with all that being said, these are all minor problems, because overall, Resident Evil Village is a great gaming experience throughout, and one that I can't recommend enough. It is simultaneously a great horror title, action game, and just a terrific experience all around. Resident Evil Village is a great game, and one that perfectly reflects the Resident Evil franchise's themes as a whole. Definitely play this game when you get the chance. So that was another video, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell so that you're notified for when I release that spoiler-filled deep dive into Resident Evil Village that I have in the works. Also, please consider contributing to my Patreon, because that helps keep me going. The link is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones, and David Devlin and Mom. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.